It's a special kind of poison, the kind you only get from family. My name is Natalie Turner, and for my entire life, my family has been feeding it to me in smiling silver-plated spoonfuls. They called me the family disappointment, the broke little lost cause, while my perfect sister Liv prepared to marry into an empire. They thought I was a joke. What they didn't know is that my little hobby had made me a millionaire. And when they decided to destroy the one place I ever felt safe for her wedding, they gave me a choice: stay the victim or become the villain of their story. What would you do? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The night my family set my old life on fire began as all my personal disasters did with my sister's smile. It was the smile she saved just for me, all teeth, no warmth, and coated in a thick, sweet layer of pity. We were seated around the 17-foot mahogany slab my father called a dining table. The air in the Turner estate so cold it felt like a mausoleum. I gripped the silver fork, the Turner family crest digging into my palm. It was always cold in this room, the air conditioning cranked to meat locker status year-round. My thin cardigan, the one Liv had called adorably rustic, which meant cheap, was useless against it. The whole house smelled the way it always did, lemon polish, old money, and a faint metallic tang of disappointment. My disappointment specifically. I was the centerpiece of that disappointment. Natalie Turner, 29. The family charity case. The daughter, who lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat, drove a 20-year-old Ford Ranger held together by rust and spite, and ran what my father charitably called her little computer garden club. I kept my eyes on my plate, the chilled asparagus tasting like wax, while the spotlight, as always, found my sister. Olivia. Liv, 32, and glowing with the kind of high-gloss perfection that costs 6 figures a year to maintain, raised her left hand. The 5-carat diamond, a simple starter ring from her fiancé Bryce Harrison, caught the chandelier light and blasted it straight into my eyes. Bryce sat beside her, a human razor blade in a $5,000 suit. He hadn't looked at me once, too busy talking synergy and leveraging assets with my father. They weren't just planning a wedding, they were finalizing a merger. Arthur Turner. My father cleared his throat and stood up, his wine glass held high. "A toast," he boomed, his voice echoing off the silk wallpaper, "to the future of the Turner legacy." His eyes met Liv's, warm and proud. To Olivia for carrying that legacy forward with strength and vision. Then his gaze swung to me, the warmth vanishing, replaced by that familiar heavy sigh of a burden. And to Natalie, for still finding her soil. The table tittered. My mother, Eleanor, reached over and patted my hand, her skin dry as paper, her smile brittle with anxiety. "We're just so proud of you for trying, dear," she whispered, as if trying was a terminal illness. I just nodded. I let them have it. I let them have their poor Nat. It was easier. It was safer. If they knew the truth, they wouldn't pity me, they'd destroy me. They thought my garden club was a neighborhood newsletter. They had no idea that TerraSource Tech was my rebellion, my life's work forged in the coffee shops and late nights they so openly mocked. While they talked commodities and hostile takeovers, I was thinking about crop yields in Appalachia and water reclamation in the Dust Bowl. My garden club was at that very moment running predictive analytics on a drought pattern that was threatening to wipe out 3 states' worth of family farms. TerraSource wasn't a club. It was a B Corp I built from the ground up, a silent, sharp fuck you to the world they inhabited. We designed open-source, high-yield agricultural technology, hydroponic systems, soil sensors, data modeling. And we gave it to small, independent farms, the kind of people my father would rather pave over for a strip mall. It was my passion. It was my freedom. And it was, to their profound ignorance, massively successful. 2 months ago, TerraSource had secured a multi-million-dollar federal grant to revitalize rural farming communities across the Rust Belt. My beat-up truck was a choice, a rejection of their values. My small apartment was my sanctuary. I lived simply because I wasn't trapped by the grotesque performance art of their wealth. I was free and they were suffocating in their lemon-scented tomb. Now for the real news, Liv trilled, clapping her hands. We've finally booked the venue. She looked at Bryce, her eyes wet with theatrical emotion. Daddy Bryce, it's official. We're getting married at Redwood Creek Camp. My head snapped up. A sharp, genuine pang of joy hit my chest, so sudden it stole my breath. Redwood Creek, the only place in my entire childhood I hadn't felt judged. The smell of pine needles and damp earth, the creak of the wooden cabins, the freedom of the lake. I wasn't Natalie Turner, the failure at Redwood Creek. I was just Nat. I was the kid who could skip a stone 9 times, who knew where the bald eagle nested, who could identify poison oak from 50 yards. It was the only part of my past that didn't feel contaminated by them. It was my sanctuary. But Liv was already sighing, her face collapsing into a mask of tragedy. It's so sad, she said, dabbing at a non-existent tear. The camp is completely bankrupt. Can you imagine just letting a place like that go? She shook her head. We're booking the very last weekend. She announced, her voice dropping to a somber whisper, as if she were announcing a death. The day after the wedding, the county auctions it off to some developer. We're literally the last people who will ever see it standing. My stomach turned to ice. Bankrupt. How it had always been solvent, run by the same family for 50 years. A developer? I asked, my voice barely a croak. Bryce finally glanced at me, his expression one of profound boredom. It's not awful, Natalie. It's progress. Land that isn't appreciating is a liability. That camp was a liability. He said liability like he was talking about me. Liv waved her hand dismissively. Some condo monstrosity, who cares? The point is, we're giving it a proper send-off. My father stood again, raising his glass higher this time. Don't you worry your pretty head about it, sweetheart, he said to Liv, his voice dripping with condescension, ignoring my question. I told you I'd handle it. You'll have your perfect day and we'll all get to say a proper goodbye to that old dump. My blood felt thick and slow. Handle what? I asked. Arthur just smiled at Liv. A proper goodbye. The words hung in the air, antiseptic and final. He turned his gaze to Bryce, who was sipping his scotch, a predatory stillness in his features. They shared a look. It was brief. It was cold. It was the look of 2 sharks that had just cornered their prey. It wasn't just agreement. It was triumph. It was the sealed bid, backroom deal, ink is dry kind of triumph. And I knew. In that single, sickening instant, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a tragedy. This was an execution. They weren't just letting the camp die. They were holding the pillow over its face. And my sister's wedding was just the victory party. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a eulogy. I drove home on autopilot, my hands strangling the steering wheel of my truck. That look. I couldn't shake that look. It was the look my father got right before he liquidated a competitor, the look of a checkmate delivered 10 moves in advance. This wasn't a proper goodbye. This was a scorched earth operation. They weren't just paving a summer camp. They were paving me. They were taking the one piece of my life that was still clean, the one memory that didn't belong to them, and they were going to bulldoze it, name it after themselves, and toast it with champagne. The dread was a physical weight, a cold stone in my gut. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the final act of my erasure. By the time I slammed the door to my apartment, the dread had hardened into something else. Something cold and sharp. Something useful. I didn't turn on the lights. I dropped my keys, walked straight to my workstation, and woke the monitors. This was my real home. Not the sterile mansion, not this cramped apartment, but the clean, logical glow of the command line. This was my sanctuary now. And they weren't taking this either. My family saw me as a Luddite, a dirt worshiper. They had no idea that TerraSource ran on one of the most sophisticated data analysis platforms in the country. They thought I planted flowers. I monitored global supply chains. I did what I always do when I feel threatened. I started digging. I bypassed the public-facing county portal and went straight into the assessor's database. I pulled the parcel history for Redwood Creek Camp. My father was smart, but he was arrogant. He assumed no one was watching. He assumed I wasn't capable of watching. The records loaded, and the cold stone in my gut dropped into an abyss. It wasn't simple bankruptcy. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a siege. I cross-referenced the dates. 6 months ago, a flurry of activity. A new high-interest lien filed against the property by an obscure creditor I'd never heard of. 2 weeks later, another. Then a vendor lawsuit for an unpaid bill. Then a complaint filed with the county health board, triggering a mandatory and expensive septic review. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The camp hadn't just failed. It had been bled dry. It was sabotage, clean and professional. I had to see it. I grabbed my keys, my laptop bag, and a high-capacity power bank. The 40-minute drive to the camp was a blur. I took the old logging road, the one my truck could handle, and parked under the massive pine that marked the trail to the cabins. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar. It was the smell of my own freedom. The main lodge looked tired, the paint peeling, the big "Welcome Campers" sign hanging by one chain. But it was still beautiful. It was real. I found a man in his 30s on the porch of the mess hall loading boxes into a U-Haul. He was pale, dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with the heavy, exhausted motions of a man who had already accepted defeat. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat. "Tours are over. Places closed. Forever." "Are you Ben?" I asked. His father Mark had run this place his whole life. "I'm a friend of the camp." He squinted at me, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Ben, yeah. My dad, he's sick. Left me to this." He kicked the box. "A friend, huh? We're fresh out of those." "What happened?" I asked gently. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "What happened? Aggressive market forces. That's what the lawyers called it. We were fine. We always made it work. Then 6 months ago, hell opened up. Every creditor we'd ever had suddenly called in their markers. New debts I'd never even heard of. Lawsuits we were trying to fight. Trying to get the county to approve a community land trust, turn this place over to the public." His voice cracked. "But we're being crushed. The legal fees, the liens. We're out of time. The auction's in 2 weeks. Some developer is going to get it for nothing." "What developer?" I asked, my voice as quiet as the forest floor. "The one who's been circling us like a vulture. The one who's been offering to take this burden off our hands for pennies on the dollar." He spat the name like it was poison. "Summit Crest Properties, LLC. My blood ran cold. It was the perfect corporate, sterile, soulless name. It was the kind of name my father's firm generated by the dozen. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry, Ben." I walked back to my truck, my heart hammering a sick rhythm against my ribs. I sat in the cab, the smell of pine thick in the air, and pulled out my laptop. I tethered it to my phone and ran the name. Summit Crest Properties, LLC. My fingers flew. It was a shell, just as I expected. Registered in Delaware 3 months ago. No public holdings, no history. But it had a registered agent. A name I knew. The name of the man who sat on the board of my father's holding company. The man who handled his most sensitive acquisitions. I kept digging, following the money using the private databases TerraSource maintained. The funding for Summit Crest wasn't from my father's primary accounts. It was smarter than that. It was routed through a private equity fund. I ran the fund's name. The screen refreshed. My breath hitched. The fund manager was a senior partner at Harrison Equity, Bryce's family. The full picture slammed into me, sucking the air from my lungs. This was a pincer movement. A hostile takeover. My father and Bryce weren't just bidding on the camp. They were the ones causing the bankruptcy. They engineered the crisis. They manufactured the liens, strangled the camp's finances, and forced the auction, ensuring they were the only viable bidder. They were going to steal it. And the wedding, Liv's perfect day, it was the ultimate insult. The final triumphant twist of the knife. They were going to celebrate their kill on the victim's grave. My hands were shaking. I closed the laptop, the silence of the woods deafening. Just as the rage began to boil, turning the ice in my veins to fire, my phone buzzed. A group text. It was from Liv. Time to talk dresses, ladies found the perfect ones. Don't worry, Nat. I have a few budget-friendly options for you. We can't have you looking homeless next to Bryce's family. I was still sitting in my truck, parked under the dying "Welcome Campers" sign. The smell of pine mixing with the metallic taste of rage in my mouth when my phone rang. The screen flashed Olivia. Of course. The follow-up text wasn't enough. The humiliation had to be delivered personally, where she could hear me squirm. I let it ring twice, took a long, slow breath, and tapped the screen. Hey, Liv. Nat, hi. Her voice was a weapon forged from fake sugary concern and sharpened with condescension. You saw my text, right? I am so excited. I was just on the phone with the boutique, and... She let out a long, dramatic sigh, the kind she'd perfected for disappointing waiters. So the bridesmaid dresses are $1,200. I waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of a distant woodpecker. $1, $200, I repeated, my voice a flat, dead thing. I know, she gushed, as if we were both suffering this injustice together. It's just a lot, especially for you right now. I know things are tight, so I was looking and I found this amazing alternative on Poshmark. It's almost the exact same color, a really similar cut. It's only 2 sizes too big, and the wine stain is barely noticeable. Seriously, my seamstress can probably fix it. I don't want you to be embarrassed. Embarrassed. The word hung in the air, a tiny, perfect little grenade. This was the core of it. This was the betrayal. It wasn't just an insult. It was a systematic campaign. It was the narrative they needed to be true. I wasn't a person to them. I was a prop. I was the before picture they used to make their after look so much brighter. They needed me to be small. They needed me to be poor, pathetic, and grateful for their wine-stained scraps. The rage was a physical thing, a hot spike behind my eyes, but beneath it was a chasm of sorrow. This was my sister. The same sister who I'd taught to ride a bike on this very patch of gravel, the one whose skinned knees I'd bandaged. She was now the one holding the knife, and she was doing it with a smile, believing it was an act of charity. This was how they defined me. This was all I would ever be to them. That's thoughtful, Liv. I managed, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. I'll think about it. Great. Oh, one more thing, she said, her tone shifting, becoming conspiratorial. Actually, Nat, since you can't, contribute, the word hung unspoken, thick and ugly. Financially, maybe you could help Bryce and me in another way. Here it comes, the other boot. What kind of help? Well, Daddy and Bryce are handling all the boring legal stuff with the camp, getting it ready for the big day. Her voice was light casual, as if discussing the weather. The thing is, we need to fast-track some of the demolition permits. The county is being such a drag. They keep asking for environmental impact studies, and who has time for that? My blood went still. Demolition permits. Yeah, just to clear out some of the old unsafe structures before the wedding. We want a clean slate for the photos. Anyway, Bryce needs a community impact letter, just something official looking, stating that the camp is basically a biohazard. Mold, structural instability, maybe some endangered bats. Whatever. Just something to scare the zoning board into moving faster. She laughed. Since you're so good with nature stuff, she said the word nature like it was something sticky she'd stepped in, you could write it. You run that little environmental club, right, TerraSource? It would look perfect coming from you. It would just be a huge help. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white, the plastic groaning. The air left my lungs. The world tilted. The rage, the sorrow, it all vanished, replaced by a terrible cold and perfect clarity. This was it. This was the breaking point. They didn't just want me to be a silent victim. They didn't just want to insult me with a stained, oversized dress. They wanted me to be an accomplice. They wanted me to sign the death warrant for my own sanctuary. They wanted me to lie, to commit fraud, to betray my company's mission and my entire life's work just to help them get their demolition permits and fast-track their condo development. They wanted to use my little garden club, the one thing I had built for myself, as the weapon to destroy the one memory I cherished. It was monstrous, it was grotesque, and it was in a sickening way the most honest thing they had ever asked of me. They weren't just paving the camp, they were asking me to pour the concrete. I closed my eyes. I saw the camp. I saw the massive pine trees, the sunlight on the lake, Ben's exhausted, defeated face. And then I saw my father and Bryce, laughing, shaking hands, their condo renderings gleaming under a sterile light. I opened my eyes. The path ahead was no longer dark. It was a straight, bright, burning line. I let out a small, broken-sounding sigh, a perfect imitation of the woman they thought I was. "Oh, Liv. A letter, wow. That sounds really important. For Bryce." "It is," she chirped, sensing victory. "He's been so stressed about it." Yeah, I can look into that for you," I whispered. I'll see what I can draft." "Oh, Nat, you're a lifesaver. Seriously, this is so much better than you just writing a check you can't cash." She laughed, a light tinkling sound that scraped against my nerves. "Okay, gotta run. Bryce is taking me to look at yachts, love you." The line clicked dead. I sat in the truck for 1 full minute. The silence of the forest was absolute. I was no longer the girl in the poshmark dress. I was no longer the family disappointment. I was Natalie Turner, CEO of TerraSource Tech, and my family had just declared war on the only thing I loved. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my simple life for failure. They were about to find out in the most expensive way possible exactly how wrong they were. My hands were perfectly steady now. I pulled my phone back out. I didn't call my friends. I didn't call my mother. I hit a speed dial number on my encrypted line. It rang once. "Ms. Turner, everything all right?" His voice was calm, precise. "My wealth manager." "Everything's fine, David. I need to make a move. I need you to liquidate $18 million in vested TerraSource stock. I want the cash in a new blind holding company by 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll send you the incorporation details in 5 minutes." There was a pause, not of shock, but of calculation. "That's a significant liquidation, Ms. Turner. A passion project." "No," I said, my voice cold. "A hostile acquisition, and get me the best real estate lawyer in the state, not the most expensive, the meanest." Another beat. "Understood. I'll have a list in an hour." "What's the play, Natalie?" I started the truck, the engines rumble, a low growl in the quiet woods. I looked at the welcome campers sign hanging by its last hinge. I put the truck in gear. "The play, I'm going to war." I didn't go back to Ben as a friend of the camp. I went back the next morning as a CEO. He was in the mess hall, taping up the last of the kitchen boxes, his shoulders slumped in the gray morning light. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Ben," I said. He didn't look up. "I told you we're closed. The auction's in 10 days. It's over." I put my laptop bag on one of the dusty wooden tables. "I know who Summit Crest Properties is." That got his attention. He straightened up, his eyes hollow. "I know what they're doing, and I'm going to stop them." He let out a bitter approximation of a laugh. "Yeah, you and what army they're sharks. They've got millions." "So do I said. He stared at me, really looked at me for the first time. The torn jeans, the old truck, the cheap cardigan. I looked like a broke college kid. I opened my laptop and turned it toward him. The screen was open to the TerraSource Tech homepage, our federal grant number and mission statement displayed in clean, bold type. My name is Natalie Turner, and that little environmental club my sister told you about, that's my company. I let him read. I watched his eyes scan the words, the grant figures, the project partners. My family, they're the ones doing this. Arthur Turner is my father. Bryce Harrison is my sister's fiancé. Their summit crest. Ben's face went from exhausted to a pale, white-hot rage. Turner. Arthur Turner. That bastard. He's your father. He is. I said, my voice flat. They think I'm a joke. They think this place is a joke. They think you're a joke. Let's prove them wrong. How? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Even if you have the money, the auction is public. They'll just outbid you. I'm not just going to buy the camp, Ben. That's their move. That's the rich girl savior bullshit. This is your home. It's your family's legacy. I'm not here to take it from you. I'm here to give it back. I laid out the plan. My new LLC NT Holdings was already funded. Ben would be my proxy at the auction. When we won, NT Holdings would immediately donate the property in its entirety, free and clear, to the community land trust he had been trying to build. I'm not just paying off your debt, Ben, I said, my voice gaining the momentum I felt in my chest. I'm giving you the land, permanently. And then I tapped the TerraSource logo. My company will partner with your trust. We'll build the sustainable, state-of-the-art agricultural education center you wanted. We'll use my tech, my funding, my team. We'll create a real legacy here, not whatever 50-story monument to greed they want to build. He stared at me, the first spark of actual hope I'd seen in his eyes flickering to life. You'd do that. I'm already doing it, I said. The next 9 days were a blur, not of family dinners, but of war rooms. My legal team was a scalpel. We analyzed Summit Crest's capital, my father's known credit lines, Bryce's family fund. We built a financial profile. We knew down to the dollar exactly what their ceiling was. To my family, I simply vanished. I was sick. I had a terrible flu. I was overwhelmed by my little job and too sensitive about the wedding. The texts were a constant, obnoxious barrage. My mother, Honey Liv, is so stressed about the tasting. Can't you just come? Stop being so sensitive. It's her wedding. Then 2 days later, Natalie, your sister, is beside herself. You're being incredibly selfish. You need to be there for her. And from Liv daily, you better not be bailing on my shower, Nat. It's the least you can do. And I need that letter for Bryce. I ignored them all. I was too busy with my lawyers finalizing the $18 million wire transfer to the holding company. I was forced to attend the bridal shower. I couldn't skip it. It would raise too much suspicion. The auction was the next day. I walked into the grand ballroom at the St. Regis, a grotesque performance of wealth. Ice sculptures, a string quartet. Women I'd known my whole life air-kissing me while their eyes sized up my $40 dress. I sat in the corner, nursing a flute of champagne I didn't drink, feeling like a ghost. Then came the gifts. Liv sat on a white throne-like chair, opening box after box of baccarat crystal and designer luggage. Then she got to mine. I'd brought a bottle of decent scotch, something I knew she'd just give to Bryce, but she saved the pity gifts for a special performance. And these, from my sweet, struggling sister. My mother and 2 of my aunts cooed. One by one, Liv pulled them out of a small reusable grocery bag. A set of dollar store plastic measuring cups. A $10 Starbucks card. A guide to budgeting pamphlet. It wasn't from me. It was for me. A little charity basket. The room awed at my family's thoughtfulness. Liv then stood to make a speech. I just want to thank everyone. but especially my family for teaching me how important it is to be generous," she said, her eyes finding me to those less fortunate. I just smiled. I smiled and I nodded, and I let the poison wash over me. One more day. The auction was held in the beige fluorescent lit basement of the county courthouse. It smelled like stale coffee and old paper. Ben was at the front, pale, his cheap suit freshly pressed. I was parked a block away in my truck, my laptop open and encrypted comms line live to Ben's earbud. I watched the live feed from the county's terrible webcam. The room was mostly empty, save for a few bottom-feeder developers and one man in a perfectly tailored Brioni suit, my father's lawyer. He was representing Summit Crest Properties, and he looked profoundly offensively smug. The auctioneer started. Lot 34 Redwood Creek Camp. Bidding starts at $5 million. The Summit Crest lawyer raised his paddle. 5. A bottom feeder. 6. The lawyer not even looking up from his phone. 8. The room went quiet. The other bidders shook their heads. The lawyer, 10 million. He smirked. This was his ceiling. He was just clearing the room. Going once, the auctioneer droned. Ben, I said into my mic. Now. Ben, his hand shaking so hard I could see it on the webcam, raised his number. 11 million. The lawyer's head snapped up. His smirk vanished. He looked at Ben, genuinely confused, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken. He made a frantic, whispered call. 12 million, he snapped. 13, Ben said, his voice steadier. 13.5, the lawyer shot back. He was sweating now. This wasn't the plan. 14, Ben said. 14.5, the lawyer yelled. He was on the phone, his face red. I could imagine my father on the other end screaming. This was their absolute limit. We knew it. Ben, pale but steady, looked at the webcam. Natalie, he whispered. I watched the lawyer, a man who had mocked me at family Christmases. I thought of Liv's generous speech. I thought of the wine-stained dress. Finish it, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. Ben took a breath. He lowered his hand. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 14.5 going once. Wait, Ben shouted. The room froze. He stood up. $18 million. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial carpet. The lawyer's jaw unhinged. He stared. He looked at his phone, then back at Ben, then just deflated. He threw his monogrammed pen down on the table. It skittered off and hit the floor. Sold. The gavel cracked, the sound like a gunshot. Sold to NT Holdings for $18 million. My line with Ben exploded in a garbled shout of joy. I slammed my laptop shut. My heart-hammering tears of pure, unadulterated adrenaline streaming down my face. I'd done it. It was ours. I was still gasping, laughing, crying when my other phone, my personal phone, started buzzing. I wiped my eyes and looked at the screen. It was Liv. I let the joy drain away, replaced it with the old familiar mask, and answered. OMG, Nat, where are you? She shrieked, oblivious. You will not believe the day I've had Dad just called some psycho billionaire from like China or something, just tried to outbid us for the camp. It was insane, but don't worry. Dad's lawyers handled it. It's ours. He got the call like an hour ago. The celebration and reveal dinner is tomorrow night at Per Se. You have to be there. And don't forget that letter. Bryce really needs it. Okay, gotta go. She hung up. I stared at the phone. Handled it. My blood ran cold. They thought they won. The private room at Per Se was insufferable. It was a glass box overlooking the city, filled with 24 of the most predatory human beings on the eastern seaboard. The entire Turner and Harrison families, plus a curated selection of C-suite partners from my father's firm and Bryce's equity group. This wasn't a celebration. It was a merger party, a public confirmation of their new unified empire. The air was thick with the smell of truffle oil and smug self-congratulation. I arrived last intentionally. I'd swapped my jeans for a simple 10-year-old black sheath dress. My hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun. No makeup, no jewelry. I looked like the help, and I knew it. My mother Eleanor saw me first, her face tightening in a rictus of social horror. She power-walked over, grabbing my elbow in a pincer grip. "Natalie, my God," she hissed, her voice a low vibration of panic. "You look ill. Go sit in the back. Don't mingle." Liv shot me a look of pure, unadulterated exasperation from across the room, a "why must I suffer this" eye roll, before turning back to Bryce and laughing at something he said. I was an embarrassment, a smudge on their perfect glossy photograph. I let my mother shove me into a dark corner, and I waited. I watched them toast. I watched them laugh. I watched them congratulate each other on a victory they hadn't even secured. The lie they'd been told, that they had handled it, that the camp was theirs, was so complete, so arrogant, it had never occurred to them to even double-check the auction's public records. They just assumed they'd won. Finally, my father stood tapping his crystal glass with a spoon. The room fell into a reverent hush. "Friends, family, partners," he began, his voice radiating the kind of effortless power that came from a lifetime of crushing people. "We are here tonight to toast the future, to toast progress." He smiled, a thin reptilian gesture. "And to toast my brilliant daughter Olivia and my future son-in-law Bryce, who had the vision to secure the future of the Turner-Harrison legacy." He raised his glass higher. "We are proud to announce our new 50-story luxury development, a monument to that vision. Gentlemen, ladies, I give you the Redwood Estates at Turner's Point." The room erupted in applause. Turner's Point. He was renaming the land after himself. He was wiping its history, its memory, its very name from the map and replacing it with his own. It was the most vulgar, ego-driven display I'd ever witnessed. I felt a cold, clean stillness settle over me. This was it. Liv stood up, beaming, basking in the applause, as if she'd laid the foundation herself. "Oh, Daddy," she gushed, touching her heart. "Bryce, thank you. This is more than I ever dreamed of." She scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on me, hidden in the shadows. Her smile widened, becoming a parody of sisterly love. "And I want to thank my sister Natalie." Every head in the room turned. I could feel their eyes on me, this strange, drab little bird in the corner. "Nat, we all know how much you love that dirty, sentimental old place." The condescension was so thick I could have bottled it. "You spent all your time there in the mud." The room tittered. "So in your honor," she continued, "Bryce and I have decided to name a very special part of the new development after you." She paused for dramatic effect, her smile blinding. "We're naming the 10-by-10-foot dog park in the condo complex the Natalie Turner Memorial Patch." The room howled. Not just laughed, but howled with derisive, braying laughter. My father clapped Bryce on the back. Bryce just smirked, sipping his scotch. They were laughing at the memorial patch. For me, the dead, pathetic little sister. Liv, still glowing from her joke, held her hand out to me. "Oh, Nat, speaking of, did you bring that letter for us, hon? That little environmental report? We need it for the filing on Monday." This was it. The moment. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly on the polished floor. The laughter died as I stood up. I walked calmly to the front of the room, past my father, past a confused-looking Liv, to the large projector screen they'd been using for a slideshow of the Turner family. My hands were perfectly steady. "I did bring a letter, Liv." I pulled a small black flash drive from the pocket of my simple dress. "But I'm afraid there's been a profound misunderstanding." My mother hissed my name. "Natalie, sit down." I ignored her. I plugged the drive into the laptop. "You've all been celebrating the wrong project." I clicked the file. The screen flickered. The grotesque, gold-plated logo for the Redwood Estates at Turner's Point vanished. It was replaced by a clean green and blue logo, the TerraSource Tech and Redwood Creek Trust, and beside it, a stunning architectural rendering of a low-profile sustainable campus integrated perfectly into the old-growth forest. It showed high-tech greenhouses, a rebuilt and modernized lodge, and a beautiful, accessible community center. The room was utterly silent. My father was the first to speak. He let out a short, barking laugh. "What is this? Did you make this in your art class, Natalie? Is this your school project?" "This," I said, my voice quiet but clear, echoing in the tomb-like room, "is the actual future of Redwood Creek." I turned to face him. As of 4 p.m. yesterday, the property at 4000 Redwood Trail was purchased in a public auction by NT Holdings for $18 million. As of 8 a.m. this morning, NT Holdings donated that property in full to the Redwood Creek Community Land Trust, which is now funded by a $20 million endowment from my company, TerraSource Tech. You could have heard a stock pin drop. I watched Bryce's face, the color draining from it. He was frantically scrolling on his phone, his thumb a white blur. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice sick. "Arthur, Summit Crest. It lost the auction. The winner, NT Holdings." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning terrible comprehension. Liv just stared, her perfect smile frozen, her brain short-circuiting. "NT," she said, her voice a high-pitched squeak. "NT Holdings. No, no, that's impossible." She pointed a shaking finger at me. You're nobody. You're broke. You couldn't afford a bridesmaid dress. The dam broke. The adrenaline, the rage, the years of humiliation, it all synthesized into a single cold, powerful voice. My voice. "You're right, Liv," I said, meeting her gaze. "I couldn't afford a $1,200 dress, so I bought your $18 million wedding venue instead." I turned to my father. He looked like I had physically struck him. "You wanted a legacy, Dad, so you tried to steal a community's. You tried to pave a sanctuary and name it after yourself. You mocked my little computer garden club." I took a step closer. "My little garden club, TerraSource Tech, just closed a $90 million partnership with the Department of Agriculture to revitalize rural America. My legacy feeds people. Yours just evicts them." His face was purple. His partners were staring, mouths agape. Finally, I looked at Liv. She was trembling, tears of mascara-streaked rage welling in her eyes. "You wanted me to write a letter, Liv. You wanted me to say the camp was a biohazard. You were right about one thing. It was a hazard. It was a hazard to your Redwood Estates deal. And you wanted to give me a memorial patch." I smiled, a real smile this time, and it felt like pulling a knife. "Don't worry about it. I'm keeping the camp's original sign. The big redwood one at the entrance. The one with our family name on the founding donors plaque. The one you were going to bulldoze for your dog park." That's when she shattered. It wasn't a cry, it was a scream, a raw, primal shriek of pure, thwarted greed. "My wedding!" she screamed, lunging toward me before Bryce grabbed her arm. You bitch! You ruined my wedding!" The room was chaos. Partners were standing up, whispering. My mother was sobbing. My father was just staring mute, his empire crumbling in his mind. I walked calmly to the door. I paused, my hand on the polished brass handle, and looked back at the wreckage. "Oh, the wedding," I said, my voice dangerously light. "It's canceled. The new owners, the Redwood Creek Trust, they're very particular about who's on their land." I let that hang in the air. "You should know. You're trespassing." I turned to the horrified restaurant manager who was hovering by the doorway. "I have the new deed of trust right here," I said, pulling another document from my simple purse. "This property is a public trust, not a private development. This celebration is a fraudulent press event." Have them all charged with securities fraud, especially my father. I let the document fall onto the manager's podium, and I walked out. I didn't run. I walked my back straight into the cool night air, leaving them behind in the ruins of the empire they thought they'd built. I didn't speed on the way home. I drove my old truck under the speed limit, both hands on the wheel, the radio silent. The adrenaline from the restaurant had drained away, leaving a vast hollow numbness. There was no triumph, no celebratory fist pump. I had just detonated my entire life, and the silence in the cab of my truck felt like the ringing in your ears after a bomb goes off. I parked in my usual spot, went up the creaking stairs to my apartment, and unlocked the door. The second I stepped inside, the silence was broken. My personal phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, was vibrating so violently against the laminate that it sounded like a trapped hornet. I looked at the screen. 37 missed calls, 92 new messages, a black hole of rage and pleading. I turned the ringer off, but the screen kept flashing a relentless strobe light in the dark. Arthur Turner, Eleanor Turner, Olivia Turner, Arthur Turner, Arthur Turner. I sat on my couch, not turning on the lights, and let it go to voicemail. After an hour, the calls finally stopped. I poured a glass of water, my hand shaking almost imperceptibly, and pressed play. The first was from my mother, hysterical just as I knew it would be. "Natalie, how could you—" She shrieked, her voice thin and ragged with tears. "How could you do this to us? To your sister? You've destroyed this family. Do you hear me? Destroyed us. Your father is with his lawyers, Natalie. His lawyers, you call your sister, and you call your father, and you apologize." The message ended in a string of garbled sobs. The next was from my father. One message. It was 10 seconds long, his voice a low, ice-cold monotone that was far more terrifying than my mother's hysterics. "You have made a grave mistake, a mistake you cannot comprehend. You will undo this, or as of this moment, you are no longer my daughter." The click was as final as a gunshot. Then there was Liv's. It wasn't one message. It was 12, a rambling 20-minute opera of her complete psychological collapse. It started with rage. "I will end you, Natalie. Do you hear me? I will sue you for everything. You are a dead, jealous, pathetic nothing, and I will burn your little garden club to the ground." Then the rage cracked, and the desperation flooded in. "He left me. Nat Bryce left me." Her voice dissolved into a wet, pathetic wail. He walked out. He said the deal was dead. He said I was a liability. My life is over. Over." And finally the pleading. "Natty, please, just give me the wedding. Just the camp. I'll do anything. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I said those things. I'm sorry about the dress, just please, I can't lose this." I deleted them all, one by one. The rage, the threats, the crocodile tears. I felt nothing, just tired. I opened my laptop, my work laptop. My team had, as instructed, sent the press release to a targeted list of local and national business journals at exactly 9 p.m. an hour into the dinner. The story was already the headline on the Metro Business Journal's homepage. Local tech CEO Natalie Turner saves Redwood Creek, thwarts hostile takeover by Turner Development. The article was brutal, clinically detailing how Summit Crest Properties and LLC, linked to Arthur Turner and Harrison Equity, had systematically suffocated the camp's finances to force a predatory auction, and how TerraSource Tech's founder, Mr. Turner's own daughter, had stepped in at the last minute, purchasing the property and donating it to a community land trust. The fallout was immediate. I watched the after-hours ticker for Turner Development. It was a waterfall of red. The Redwood Estates wasn't just a project. It was their flagship, the linchpin of the Harrison merger. The bad PR of a billionaire father trying to steamroll a community camp, only to be stopped by his own B Corp daughter. It was a narrative so perfect, so devastating, it was already spreading to social media. My father's partners, the ones who had been laughing at the memorial patch, were trapped. Bryce and the Harrison family hadn't just cut ties, they'd run for their lives, severing the merger before the ink was even dry. Liv hadn't just lost a fiancé, she'd lost her entire future. I closed the laptop. I wasn't celebrating. I was grieving. Not for them, but for the idea of them. For the family I wished I'd had. The mother who might have protected me, the father who might have been proud of me, the sister who might have loved me. I was grieving the fact that I had ever for 1 second wished for their approval. I slept for 3 hours, woke up before dawn, and drove. I drove to the one place that made sense. I drove to the camp. I parked the truck and just walked, the air sharp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. The sun was just starting to filter through the massive redwoods, turning the mist to gold. It was so quiet. No screaming voicemails, no crashing stock tickers. Just the sound of my own boots on the trail. Ben was already there on the porch of the main lodge, a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but his eyes were clear for the first time. He just nodded at me, a silent, profound understanding passing between us. He handed me a second mug. "It's safe," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It's safe," he agreed. I stood there watching the sunrise paint the lodge in warm light. It was ours. It was real. I finally let myself feel it, not triumph, but peace. A deep, quiet, earned peace. And it was in that exact moment of stillness that the peace was shattered. The crunch of gravel. I turned. A county police car was pulling up the long driveway, its blue and red lights off. But its presence, a violation. A grim-faced officer got out, his hand resting on his belt. He looked from Ben to me, his eyes landing on my truck. Natalie Turner. My heart, which had finally settled, seized in my chest. "I'm Natalie Turner." He took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid you need to come with me. Your father, Arthur Turner, has filed an emergency restraining order, and he's suing you for corporate espionage." The lawsuit was, as my lawyer gleefully called it, a textbook slap suit. A strategic lawsuit against public participation. It was a rich man's tantrum, a legal battering ram designed not to win, but to drain me, to bury me in motions and fees until I buckled. The corporate espionage charge was laughable. My father claimed I had used proprietary family knowledge to sabotage his deal. The restraining order was even more pathetic, citing my violent and unstable nature based on the fact I had caused a scene at the restaurant. It was the last, desperate attempt of a dying king to prove he still had power. He had fatally underestimated me. He was still fighting the broke little girl from the memorial patch. He had no idea he was fighting Terra Source Tech. My legal team didn't just defend, they countersued. They filed for malicious prosecution and harassment, attaching a full media brief of the Summit Crest scheme and the press's reaction to it. The entire thing, restraining order included, was thrown out by a deeply unimpressed judge in less than a week. The king's final move was a checkmate against himself. The first confrontation came 3 days after the case was dismissed. He didn't come to my apartment. He didn't dare. He came to my office. I watched from my glass-walled office as my father, Arthur Turner, stood in the lobby of the TerraSource headquarters. I watched him take in the 3-story atrium, the living green walls, the hum of quiet, focused energy from my 200 employees. This wasn't a garden club. This was a state-of-the-art tech campus, and he looked for the first time in his life completely out of his depth. He looked small. My assistant buzzed me. "Ms. Turner, and Arthur Turner is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment." "Send him in," I said. He walked in his expensive suit, looking stiff and out of place against the polished concrete and reclaimed wood of my office. He was trying to project his old effortless power, but it was a costume that no longer fit. "Natalie," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "you've made your point. This is an impressive operation." "I know," I said. I didn't offer him a seat. He took a sharp breath, his patience already gone. "All right. Enough games. You've had your fun. You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed the family. Now it's time to be smart." He put his hands on his hips as if he were scolding a child. "I'm prepared to offer a truce. We'll drop all this legal nonsense. You sign the camp over to my holding company. In return, I'll make you a senior partner at Turner Development. You can run this." He waved a dismissive hand as a subsidiary. I stared at him. The sheer uncut arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. After everything, the sabotage, the insults, the lawsuit, he still thought he could buy me. He still thought the greatest thing I could ever aspire to be was him. "I don't want to be your partner, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of my entire building. "I'm your competitor, and I just won." His face went dark. "You're a fool," he spat. "You're throwing away your family. Your name for what? A pile of dirt and a bunch of ungrateful farmers." I stood up, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of him. "No, Dad, you did." The empowered moment wasn't loud, it was cold. "You threw away your family when you decided a 50-story monument to your own ego was more important than your daughter. You threw it away when you taught Liv that cruelty was a virtue and that pity was a weapon. You threw it away when you sued me for winning a fight you started." I pointed to the door. "You need to leave. My actual partners." I gestured to my team visible through the glass. "Are waiting." He looked at me, his eyes searching for the broken, apologetic little girl he had always known. She was gone. He turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked out of my office, a truly small man for the very first time. The second confrontation was harder. My mother didn't come to the office. She knew better. She came to my apartment that night, waiting for me on the steps of my building, looking lost and frail in her expensive coat. This was the one I dreaded. This was the one that hurt. "Natalie?" she said, her voice trembling as I walked up. She was crying. Real tears, not Liv's strategic ones. "Oh, honey, please." "Please what, Mom?" I asked, my key already in the lock. "Your sister, she's a wreck." She clutched my arm, her nails digging in. "She lost everything. Her wedding, her fiancé, Bryce's family. They're gone, Nat. She's not good. She's staying in her room. She's drinking. Your father won't even talk to her. He blames her. Can't you just forgive?" The question hung in the stale hallway air. Forgive. The word she had used my entire life to paper over their abuse. Forgive Liv for breaking my arm. Forgive Dad for forgetting my graduation. Forgive. 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 I looked at my mother, at this woman who had chosen to be a ghost in her own life, and the last of my old sentiment hardened and broke. "Did you ever once ask her to apologize to me?" I asked, my voice raw. "Did you ask her to apologize for the Poshmark dress, for the memorial patch, for asking me to lie and commit fraud so she could have her wedding? She was stressed." My mother cried. "She didn't mean it. She always meant it." I said, the emotional clarity hitting me like a physical blow. "And you always let her. You're not a peacemaker, Mom. You're just collateral damage. You're the one who taught her that sorry was my job." I turned and opened my door. "You chose their side, Mom. You've been choosing it for 30 years, and it was the wrong one." I stepped inside. She just stood in the hallway, her mouth open, finally silenced. I closed the door, the click of the deadbolt, the hardest, most necessary boundary I had ever set in my life. 6 months passed. The lawsuit was a bad memory. My father and mother were ghosts. The camp was alive. We didn't just rebuild it, we resurrected it. TerraSource's engineers and Ben's community volunteers worked side by side. The cabins were retrofitted with solar panels. The mess hall became a community kitchen and coding classroom. The main field became a high-tech test bed for our sustainable farming tech. It was thriving. I was there almost every day, my hands in the dirt, the smell of pine and new-mown hay replacing the lemon polish smell of my childhood. Ben and I had become a seamless team, our partnership built on mutual respect and a shared vision, the absolute antithesis of the toxic synergy my father and Bryce had preached. One afternoon, I was sorting through the mail at my desk in the newly finished camp office when I saw it. A thick cream-colored envelope. Formal, legal. From the offices of my father's estate attorney. My hands went cold. He was trying again. I tore it open, my heart hammering. My fingers didn't shake. I slid my thumb under the flap of the thick, creamy envelope and pulled out the single sheet of embossed letterhead. It wasn't another lawsuit. It was simpler. It was a formal notarized copy of my father's new will, a declaration of disinheritance. I was excised, my name surgically removed as if I had never existed. Everything, the entire Turner development empire, the sterile mansion, the penthouse in the city, the art collection, every last dollar, was left in a complex, ironclad trust to my beloved and recovering daughter, Olivia. Recovering. I read the word. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her problems, and he was only doing it to weaponize her against me. I was officially, legally, and financially an orphan. I walked out of the office, the letter in my hand. It was evening. Ben and a few of the volunteers had a small campfire going by the lake, roasting marshmallows. The air was cool and smelled of pine smoke. I stood by the fire, read the letter one more time, and then I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh. It was deep and clean and genuinely amused. He thought this was a punishment. He thought he was taking something from me. He had no idea I was already free. I folded the letter, dropped it into the heart of the fire, and watched the edges curl and blacken. I watched my name and his and all that toxic heavy money turn to weightless ash and float up into the starry sky. Ben looked up at me, a question in his eyes. "Good news?" he asked, holding out a marshmallow on a stick. "Freedom?" I said, taking it. "It's just the last of the paperwork." 3 months later, we held the grand opening of the Redwood Creek Terrasource Center. The camp wasn't just restored, it was reborn. It was loud, it was vibrant, it was packed. The main lodge, which my father had tried to condemn, was now a state-of-the-art computer lab and library filled with kids from 3 different counties, their faces lit by the glow of monitors as they learned to code. The fields where I used to play Capture the Flag were now sprawling high-tech community gardens, TerraSource sensors monitoring the soil, families harvesting bushels of fresh produce. The mess hall was a culinary training kitchen. It was everything we'd dreamed of. Ben stood on the porch of the main lodge, a microphone in his hand, his voice thick with emotion, as he thanked the community, the volunteers, and the TerraSource team. I watched from the back, leaning against one of the new support beams, content to be out of the spotlight. That's when I saw them. At the absolute edge of the property, just past the new parking lot, standing half hidden in the shadow of the main gate. 2 women. Eleanor and Olivia. My mother was wringing her hands, looking terrified, as if the very ground was hostile. Liv looked... I barely recognized her. The glossy, high-maintenance armor was gone. Her hair was its natural color, pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, a plain sweater, and no makeup. She wasn't just clean. She looked scoured, raw, smaller. She just stared, her face a blank mask of something. Regret, envy, I couldn't tell. She was watching a group of kids run past, laughing, carrying freshly picked tomatoes. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the expanse of the lawn. Then my mother tugged on her arm, a quick, fearful gesture. Liv didn't pull away. She just let herself be led. They turned and walked back to a modest, unfamiliar sedan and drove away. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just sad. A quiet, real, pathetic anticlimax. "You should be up there, you know," Ben's voice said close to my ear. He'd come up beside me holding 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to me. "I'm good right here," I said. He clinked his bottle against mine. "You did this, Nat. You saved us. All of this. It's because of you." I looked at him, at his kind, steady eyes, at his hands calloused from the same work mine were. This was real. This was a partnership built on shared dirt, not shared dividends. "No," I said, taking a sip. "You were already fighting. I just brought bigger guns," he smiled. "Well, we did this." "Yeah," I said, smiling back. "We did." It was the antithesis of everything I'd ever known. It wasn't a merger, it wasn't a contract, it was just respect. And it felt more solid than any deal my father had ever signed. Weeks later, the opening was a happy memory, and the center was just life. It was a normal Tuesday. I was in the new library, the room warm and bright, sitting on the floor with a circle of elementary school kids, reading them a story about a dragon who learns to garden. I was in the middle of a particularly fiery dragon sneeze when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again. A text. Muttering an apology to the kids, I pulled it out just to silence it. It was from an unknown number. My fingers hovered over the delete button, but the preview text caught my eye. "Hi, Nat. It's Liv." My breath hitched. I opened it. The full message was short, devoid of all her usual drama and exclamation points. "I'm in a 90-day program. I'm on day 47. They said I should make amends. I didn't want to, but thank you for not letting me get away with it. For everything. I'm sorry." I stared at the words. "I'm sorry." A simple, clean sentence I had waited my entire life to hear, and now that it was here, I felt a quiet stillness. No rage, no triumph, not even forgiveness, just a distant, faint ache for the sister I might have had. The kids were looking at me, waiting for the story. I looked at the text. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but I didn't delete it. I just let it be. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the small, heavy weight of it a strange anchor. I turned back to the circle of expectant faces, found my place on the page, and cleared my throat. "So," I said, my voice strong and clear. "Where were we?" "Ah, yes." The dragon looked at the tiny sprout. I looked up from the page, the room filled with the smell of old books and new pine, and I finally understood. My father was right about one thing. Legacy is everything. He just had no idea what the word meant. As the ashes of that old letter floated away, so did the last ties to a life that was never really hers. What did you think of Natalie's final move and her new definition of legacy? Let us know in the comments below. We truly do read every single one of your thoughts. If you enjoy stories of justice and empowerment, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.